When I was about 16, I decided that I wanted to travel around the world by motorbike. I didn't have a motorbike, nor did I have any money. And anyway, I was still at school, but I knew then that I wanted to do it, and sooner rather than later. I wanted to be free to go, just like Peter Fonda and Dennis Hopper in Easy Rider, though I would take care not to come to the same sticky end as they did in the movie. I wasn't one of those lucky people who could turn around to their parents and say, "I'd like the money to buy a motorbike and ride around the world, please." So I had to make a plan. I'm good at languages, and so I found the most lucrative language job in the world, simultaneous interpreter, trained to become one, worked for a number of years, and then packed up my bike and left. The day I was able to say, "I'm going," was one of the most liberating ever, and I highly recommend you try it. Of course, when you've dreamt about something for so long, there's the very real risk that the reality will in no way be as much fun as the dream. Fear of this is probably what keeps many people from actually doing anything with their dreams, because they realise that it's much safer not to put them to the test. It has to be said that it was not only my own dream that drove me, but the inspiration provided to many others with a similar fantasy by Ted Simon's book, Jupiter's Travels, a shimmering account of his own 4-year circumnavigation by motorbike. When I set out, I decided that my own journey would follow closely the one that he described in his book, both the route and the time he took to do it. I reckoned then that I had the funds to travel for 4 years, and to cover Europe, Africa, South and North America, New Zealand, Australia, Southeast Asia and India before returning home over ground I'd already covered in another trip to Iran and Turkey. I bought my motorbike, a BMW loosely modelled on the ones that had become so successful in the gruelling Paris-Dakar rallies, equipped myself with everything I thought I might need, and set off across the Channel from Dover. I was full of excitement, fear and anticipation, and if truth be told, more of the latter than the former. From that moment on, it's safe to say that nothing went according to plan, if indeed there was a plan. Apart from having a reasonable idea of where I intended to go and how to get there, I didn't really have any ambitions. Having survived being mistaken for a terrorist on the crossing from Greece to Israel must have been something to do with the army fatigues and parachute regiment boots, which someone had insisted would be invaluable when it came to thrashing through the rocks and the sand of the Nubian desert. I breezed south from the Sea of Galilee through some of the hotter spots of the West Bank to Jerusalem. In those days there was something about a tourist on an extravagantly overloaded motorbike with obvious world traveller pretensions which brought out a crowd and an extravagant welcome. I probably looked pretty silly, but it didn't matter. I was on my way into a mythical part of the world, the Dead Sea and the Sinai. There's definitely something about a strip of tarmac that thins and disappears to a desert horizon through a mirage of heat that gives you the feeling that you're not just riding, but travelling. The Dead Sea behind me, I made my way on to what had only recently become the Egyptian Sinai, and under the Suez Canal to Cairo. There are raised banks on either side of the Suez Canal, which mean that you only see the superstructure of the ships using it because the decks are out of sight. The impression is of tall buildings gliding through the desert sand. It's pleasantly surreal. Surreal is pretty much how I would describe what it feels like to see Cairo for the first time. Nothing can quite prepare one for Cairo, or at least Cairo on a motorbike. I don't know whether anyone really knows how many people live there, but back in 1985, people told me that there were about 12 million. Then they all seem to be driving cars, or trying to thread their way through impossibly crowded side streets in the old city. A carelessly parked donkey and cart can cause pedestrian gridlock. What a relief to flee the city to the edge of the desert, which is only a few kilometres away. That was what was so extraordinary about Cairo. You turn your back to the pyramids and face south, and there is an eternity of nothing. You turn north, and there is the seething intensity of a megacity. As I headed south along the Nile, I knew I was getting closer and closer to one of what I knew would be one of the biggest challenges of this part of Africa, the Nubian Desert and Sudan. Stories abounded about the impossible conditions. You had to cross from Aswan to Wadi Halfa on the shores of Lake Nasser by ferry. They wouldn't let you on the ferry with a motorbike, they said. They wouldn't let you take any petrol, even if they did let you take your motorbike, because a few years ago there'd been a fire aboard the old ferry and she'd sunk with all hands. If you get to Wadi Halfa with your motorbike, there will be no petrol, and there are hundreds of kilometres of desert to cross. And so it went on. I treated myself to days of inexpressibly beautiful sunsets in Aswan, hardly daring to take the next step. I stooped to bribing the captain of the ferry with a bottle of brandy to allow me and my bike on the ferry, but he would not allow any petrol. I had met a young German in Aswan, and we decided to take on the challenge of the Nubian desert together, thinking that it would help to share our trials. On the day of our departure from Aswan, the captain was in such a hurry to leave that I had to heave my enormously heavy bike from quayside to ferry as the ferry was moving away. I almost had to throw myself in the bike across the slowly widening gap between ship and shore. It takes a couple of days to cross Lake Nasser, and then, since the ferry arrives off Wadi Halfa on a Friday, having passed close to the temple of Abu Simbel, which had to be relocated stone by stone, as it would have been submerged when the Aswan Dam was built, it lies off the port for the Muslim holy day. The lake has evaporated substantially over the years since the dam was built, so the original port of Wadi Halfa is nowhere near where the edge of the water now is, or was, back in 1985. The result is that you had to teeter along a gangplank not in any way designed for overloaded motorbikes to get to the shore. And when you get there, the town of Wadi Halfa is some kilometres away. There were a few litres of petrol left in the tank, so me and Andreas gingerly proceeded to town to start looking for fuel to begin the next stretch of the journey. It was hopeless. No matter where we looked, and no matter who we asked, there was no fuel to be had. We sat and waited while we thought, possibly quite naively, people went scouting for petrol for us. We even spent valuable cupfuls of the remaining petrol going to see the commissioner, who invited us into his home and generously fed us, but who couldn't offer a solution to our petrol problem. So, after, as I remember it, a couple of days drinking tea and sharing our adventure with countless fascinated passers-by, we resolved to do the unthinkable, which was to take the train to the next town, where we were assured there would be petrol for us to continue the journey. Now, there are train journeys and there are train journeys. Having heaved our bikes into the guard's van, we awaited the advertised departure of the train at 6 in the evening. We'd taken the precaution of buying tickets in second class, having been warned that conditions in third class could be, well, cramped. We boarded the train quite comfortably some time before the departure time of 6 o'clock, but there was a huge number of people still waiting on the platform. We assumed that these were the people travelling in third class. The condition of the third class carriages was frightening. There were no windows, large holes in the roof of the carriages, and there were literally hundreds of people waiting to board for the long journey south to Atbara and Khartoum. At a few seconds before 6, a shout went up from somewhere, and what happened next was quite extraordinary. The hundreds of Sudanese who'd spent hours squatting on the platform exploded into a stampede for the carriages. There may have been people who entered the train through the doors, but what stays in my mind is the throngs of people cramming themselves and their possessions through the windows and through the holes in the roof to secure a place for themselves inside. There may be some more or less civilized conventions governing how people board trains in rush hour in the developed world, but they'd look terribly polite in comparison to what goes on when the train leaves Wadi Halfa. But you'd hope that, having boarded a train under such circumstances, seated as comfortably as conditions allowed, the rest of your journey would be expected to proceed without major incident. Well, think again. About a half an hour out of Wadi Halfa, the sun is setting over the horizon and you're settling down, depending on which class you're travelling in, to a more or less excruciatingly uncomfortable night, and there's a strange of compressed air from somewhere else in the train. From where I was sitting, it sounded as if it came from just up ahead in the space between second and first class. At first I thought nothing of it, but then, since everything else in the last day or two had left me with some pretty wild imaginings, I wondered whether the whooshing sound hadn't been the sound of compressed air escaping. Brakes? Hydraulics? A flat tyre? Coaches on trains are connected to the locomotive by, amongst other things, hydraulic pipes, aren't they? What could this mean? And then, imperceptibly, the carriage I was in began to slow down. My wildest imagining made me think that the coupling between us in second class and the first class carriages has severed. Oh, but let's face it, that sort of thing doesn't really happen. So I got up and walked towards the front of our carriage, and when I came to the end, I looked through the door. The first class carriages were going faster than us. It was pretty dire. I mean, yes, you want to put bums on the expensive seats, but leave economy class behind altogether? with marketing taken to a decidedly grotesque extreme. The rest of the train didn't come back for hours, and then it somewhat sheepishly reversed up the track towards us sometime in the middle of the night. Any hope of proceeding on our journey straight away was confounded when it transpired that the coupling had been damaged in the earlier separation. It would take all night to fix. By the next morning, the locomotive's batteries had run flat. We'd have to wait for another locomotive to be sent from Atbara, some 400 kilometres away. It was an extraordinary ride. Periodically, once the new locomotive had arrived, can't remember when, and the train had lurched off again, the train would then stop at seemingly random intervals in the middle of nowhere, and there's a lot of nowhere in the Nubian desert. In fact, it transpired, it was at prayer times, which the driver was obliged to observe just like anyone else. So the driver would bring the train to a halt, climb down onto the sand, as would almost everyone else in the train, pray, and then, slightly ahead of everyone else, climb back into the cab. Seconds later, a blast would go up from the train's horns, and the passengers, still busy on the sand, would hastily conclude their devotions and rush back to the already moving train and clamber aboard. After a night in the police compound in Atbara, Andreas and I were able to find the promised fuel, but only about enough to fill half our tanks. With about 500 kilometres to Khartoum, it was going to be touch and go, and my memory of what Ted Simon had written about the road on from Atbara left me in no doubt that this was going to be an ordeal. And so it was. Not used to riding a heavily laden bike through the sand meant that we were falling off all the time. Hours later, Andreas and I agreed to split up and go at our own pace. Sometimes I rode along the railway just to get some relief from the sand, but would soon be numb from the bone-shaking ride over the railway sleepers. In the evening, I pulled exhausted into a small settlement where I was offered a bed for the night, and my hosts were listening to the BBC World Service on the radio. It came to an end eventually, and the petrol lasted. But Khartoum brought only the news that road travel south from the capital would be impossible because of the enduring war between the government and the SPLA. Roll with the punches is an important lesson to learn when you're doing something like this. So, after a long time dreaming of taking a riverboat south up the Nile to Juba, I had to take a plane instead. Bombs and landmines made the road from Juba into Kenya impassable, so a detour through war-torn Uganda was the only option. Riding from Uganda south across the equator to the Kenyan capital Nairobi was a welcome respite, as was a long holiday on the Kenyan coast south of Mombasa. I met some extraordinary people in Africa, but none more extraordinary, I think, than two people who, together, one in the air and one on the ground, were making a crossing of Africa by microlight. We were chatting one day when Richard, the intrepid pilot, said, "Martin, are you thinking of climbing Kilimanjaro when you get to Tanzania?" Well, I suppose that everyone would have wanted to, but I said that it was probably going to be too expensive for me, so no. "How about I pay you to?" said Richard. Richard had decided that he wanted to try and fly his microlight over the summit of Kilimanjaro, and he wanted someone to be on the summit to take a picture should his attempt succeed. Some weeks later, I found myself huddling against the biting cold on the summit of Kilimanjaro as Richard coaxed his tiny aircraft towards the 19,000-foot-high mountain. He never quite got there before he ran out of petrol, but the adventures that preceded that day and the days and weeks to follow more than made up for the disappointment. I travelled with them all the way to South Africa, flew over Victoria Falls, the Okavango Delta in Botswana, and finally said farewell to them in Cape Town. It was time for a rest. I took time to explore the breathtaking dune emptiness of the Namib Desert and to make plans for the next stage in my journey, South America. A chance conversation one day with my girlfriend Sylvia resulted in the decision to buy a second bike so that we could travel to South America together. Also, I was determined not to make the crossing to the next continent by air, so I found a position crewing on a yacht. A trial outing on the yacht made it clear that Sylvia would not be able to make the journey by sea with me because, and it sounds trite to say it now, she was very easily seasick. Well, seasick is okay if you're a few miles from shore, but as any seasoned yachtsman will tell you, it's extraordinarily debilitating if it goes on for long, and it can. There are some 4,000 miles of ocean between Cape Town and Brazil, and only one island in between, St. Helena, and if you're sick all the time, it's too dangerous. With enormous reluctance and sadness, I let Sylvia crate up our bikes and ship them to South America, and then fly out to meet me once I'd reached Brazil. I left Cape Town in January 1987 with 3 others on a 32-foot boat. Ahead lay the South Atlantic, and, weather permitting, about a month under sail. The sadness and apprehension of leaving Sylvia with so much to do aside, it was like nothing else I'd ever embarked on. Months of getting the boat ready, culminating in slipping our mooring at the Royal Cape Yacht Club and heading out to the west of Robben Island into the open ocean. Cape Town and Table Mountain slipped so quickly over the horizon, and we were delivered into our first night in the South Atlantic. Nothing prepares you for this. I mean, nothing can prepare you for anything that happens to you when you loosen the ties of a familiar existence and let the unfamiliar guide you. But surrendering yourself to the immensity of an ocean aboard a glorified sailing dinghy with a roof is, well, something of an act of folly and faith combined. I'm sure that all those who do it are hoping that they will get off lightly for this act of folly and faith combined, and that the sea will be calm and the wind and weather favourable, and they try not to imagine what it'll be like if it doesn't work out that way. I certainly did. For the first 3 days we certainly seemed to have got off lightly. Towards the end of the 3rd day, however, we were sailing close to a large tuna fishing vessel, and it was obvious that they were going up and down quite a lot, and so were we, and the wind was beginning to freshen noticeably. Night was falling, and we were having to brace ourselves ever more frequently against the movement of the boat, and taking our sights with a sextant, GPS was something of a novelty in those days, was quite a challenge. Wind can come in all shapes and sizes, just as the sea, but by the middle of the night there was no longer any doubt that we were in a full-blown storm. The moon was full and the sky cloudless. At night, as I came out onto deck, for my first watch from midnight till 4 a.m, nothing could have prepared me for what I saw. Rearing up behind the boat were menacing black water mountains with foaming crests, spitting malevolently in the moonlight. The waves would lunge at the boat and the boat would try to escape ahead of them, but the sea always got the better of the boat, picking it up and hurling it along for a while before racing ahead into the night. For a while I was transfixed and would turn from the helm to see another Brobdingnagian slavering black beast lunge at the boat. Mostly they would just go spitting on their way, but sometimes they would hurl foaming water into the cockpit as they passed underneath us. For the first night of the storm I watched this with terrified fascination. But on the second night, as the storm continued unabated, I couldn't face it any longer, so my gaze remained fixed on the compass and the log for 4 hours while I tried to ignore the howling, growling beasts of prey that stalked and lunged in unceasing succession. The bad weather went on for 3 days and 3 nights, during which time no one really slept, and we had no more than a storm jib the size of a large tea-cloth to keep us from being broadsided by the seas. When the wind began to abate, the relief was palpable. We were able to shower on deck, hang out the oilskins to dry, bake, cook and joke. We were able to enjoy for the first time, really, the iridescent blue of the ocean 4 kilometres deep under our hull. Fresh fish we landed over the stern, and evening skies that were the finest of nature's art. In 2 weeks we arrived in St. Helena. After a few days of reprovisioning and just enough time to get used to walking on something that didn't try to move the other way all the time, we were back at sea. I experienced unexpected pleasure at being back in a routine on board. Day follows night, follows day. The sun would rise to its zenith, set to the horizon. The stars materialize out of a darkening sky, deploy themselves across the night. The waning moon, pale latecomer, rising from behind the cloud like the baleful eye of some huge sea cyclops, would hoist itself reluctantly onto a rising trajectory, and then fall away unnoticed to the west. To the east, the sun would rise. As 2 weeks later Salvador de Bahia appeared as if by magic on the horizon, the true enormity of making an ocean crossing under sail struck home. Take a boat, throw some canvas in the way of the wind, set a course across 4,000 miles of ocean, and somehow arrive at your destination as if you'd driven there. It was too good to be true. What to expect from the new continent? I had no preconceptions, really. I didn't even know that Sylvia had been able to get the bikes crated up and shipped, mine to Santos and hers to Buenos Aires, and get herself a flight to Rio. Brazil certainly broke onto me like carnival breaking out in a monastery. The beach and the streets seem to be what defines the people. Rich or poor, you can look $1 million in a thong, and thongs were the thing in Bahia and in Rio. Sylvia appeared as if by magic at the airport in Rio, and after a few days of sightseeing, we headed south to meet my motorbike in Santos. And there, we hit our first brick wall. Customs decided that we couldn't have the bike without depositing a US $10,000 guarantee in the bank. In itself, this wasn't such a problem, but we went through the bureaucratic mangle for 6 weeks before the bike was finally released. Whilst the administrative machinery ground imperceptibly forwards, there was nothing for us to do except stress ourselves into a stupor. This became intolerable after a while, and we took off to Iguazu to escape the frustration. It took its toll, and by the time we were finally on our way with my bike, we were exhausted. It was not a good way to start. A few days into the journey south to Argentina, Sylvia became so ill with something that we had to get her to hospital as soon as we crossed the border into Argentina. She had appendicitis and had to be operated on. The Falklands War was a fairly recent memory at the time, and I did my best to conceal my identity as a Briton, particularly in the hospital, fearing, probably quite unnecessarily, that if the staff found out where I came from, they wouldn't treat Sylvia quite as well. One day I plucked up the courage to tell one of the nurses that I was English, and to my horror, she said, in Spanish, "Ah, English, we want to kill all the English," and she motioned, spraying death with a machine gun, but fortunately laughed as well. Some weeks later, Sylvia was fit enough to travel again, and we collected her bike in Buenos Aires to begin our adventure together in earnest. Argentina was heading into winter, and so were we. Ahead of us across the southern pampas, the Andes were getting their first covering of winter snow. We were heading into the foothills of the Andes, and a carpet of lakes which by turns were mirror flat or whipped into wild inland seas by the storms. Despite my apprehensions about travelling in a country which was technically still at war with Britain, it was never an issue with the people we came into contact with. Drinking some of the world's best hot chocolate in San Carlos de Bariloche, we were chatting to a journalist about the impact of the Falklands War and the attitude of Argentines in general. As far as this man was concerned, and as a true patriot of Argentina, what Margaret Thatcher did was unforgivable, he told us. At the same time, he said, if the war had not happened, then the country would not have got rid of its megalomaniac generals, and so, in that respect, he had something to thank Margaret Thatcher for. Once again, we needed to move on and across the mountains and the border into Chile. To wait any longer in the south of Argentina would have meant the winter deepening and the snow on the mountains too. We knew that the track across the mountains climbed to 3,000 meters in some places, and the snow was certainly not much above that and getting closer every day. With a final reminder of what the official position then was on the Falklands, the sign on the right shows a map of the islands with the words Las Malvinas son Argentinas, the Falklands belong to Argentina, we headed up the long zigzags into the clouds. The weather held for us, and though it was bitterly cold, we were able to experience the spectacular beauty of southern Chile under cloudless skies. I felt it was slightly like going from the frying pan to the fire, leaving behind a country which had recently been at war with my own, but which had joyfully embraced democracy after years of military rule, and entering another where the military dictator was still very much in place. Certainly no one would spontaneously sit down and chat about politics, and whenever we did, people seemed pretty guarded, and divided between those who felt that Pinochet had brought law and order and prosperity to the country, and those who grumbled, not too loudly of course, about the military. We got a taste of what the military meant when we got to the capital, Santiago. We were strolling through the main pedestrian precinct one evening when we heard sirens approaching. To you and me, it might have been a police car or an ambulance or something. To the Chileans, it signalled something altogether different, and it caused total panic. People who had been quietly going about their business scattered in all directions as large grey buses came screeching into the pedestrian area. It was like a scene from a movie. Metal roller shutters were hastily pulled down and people ran for cover behind locked doors. Then it seemed those who remained on the streets were summarily rounded up and herded into the buses, which screeched off again. We were sitting in a cafe watching the scene unfold. After the sounds of sirens had receded, people began coming nervously out onto the streets again. It was not a good feeling. But there were plenty of other good feelings, like the relationships we struck up with the mechanics at the Honda bike dealers, who became such good friends in the time that we were there, making ready for the long journey north through the Atacama Desert. Road infrastructure in Chile was by and large pretty good, so you could cover long distances in a day. The travelling was lonely, though, and mirrored the landscape, which was spectacularly empty. Every few days, though, there were oases in the emptiness, and one where someone had made a hotel out of old buses. There was something particularly attractive about a place to stay like this, because beyond the walls, the loneliness and emptiness were absolute. For days now we'd been seeing hopelessly overladen cars and buses on the main road north, and we wondered where people were going with what appeared to be all their worldly goods strapped on. When we got to Iquique, at the northern end of the Atacama, we stumbled on the reason. Our visit coincided with a pilgrimage that takes place once every 10 years to a tiny hamlet in the middle of nowhere called La Tirana. The pilgrims visit the church in the hamlet, which is devoted to a patron saint called Carmen. But they don't just visit, they do this. They build elaborate effigies of the saint, some of them equipped with elaborate lighting and wheels, which allowed them to be manoeuvred into place on the throbbing village square in front of the church. The church square itself absolutely reverberated to the sounds of several different brass bands which competed with each other to motivate their dance troupes, who performed elaborate devotions in the crushing desert heat. The hamlet normally has a population of about 500, but during the time of the pilgrimage and festival it swells, we were told, to something like 10,000. An entire township is erected on the village perimeter with markets and mobile shops to cater for the pilgrims' every needs. Every day for about 10 days before a final climactic closing ceremony, dance troupes line up in the narrow streets leading to the village square and inch towards the church where they perform before paying their respects to the effigy inside the church. There was nowhere to stay in the village, though someone offered the floor of a cattle shed which had been vacated for the festival, so we took to our heels and camped a few kilometres away in the desert. We'd not been high into the Andean Cordillera, which rose in a succession of snow-covered volcanic peaks to the east since crossing into Chile from Argentina. Now we were heading for the Bolivian capital, La Paz, which is at over 4,000 metres. The weather got the better of us here because after climbing to about 4,600 metres into the Parque Nacional Lauca in the far north of Chile, we found ourselves in such biting cold and snow that we had to turn back to Arica to take the train. This is another one of those train journeys, though this one proceeded without the sort of incident that occurred in Sudan. The train starts at sea level in Arica, and it grinds through the night to an altitude of about 4,500 metres before crossing the Altiplano to the edge of the crater in which the Bolivian capital lies. Most of the poor people who work in La Paz live in a grim shanty which surrounds the rim of the crater called El Alto, which loosely means the high place. The name is about right. It's a brutal place, just as is La Paz itself, only it doesn't look like it. The temperature in the daytime soars to 30 degrees, while the Indian women ply their trade in the city streets, and at night, when the streets have emptied and the sellers have retreated to their shacks in El Alto, the temperature plummets to way below zero. Because of the altitude, it's an effort to breathe and move, and the Indian women chew coca leaves or drink an infusion made from them to anaesthetize themselves from the hardship. A nasty fall from her bike meant that Sylvia was laid up in a plaster cast for a few weeks while we waited for the damage to heal. It was no bad thing in a way, because the government was on one of its periodic campaigns to exact taxes from the Indian peasants who sell in the markets, and there was mass mobilization as a result. Many stories were being told of people who tried to make their way north to the Peruvian border on the shores of Lake Titicaca — we were heading that way — and who'd been attacked by peasant gangs with an axe to grind. We contented ourselves with visiting the Yungas, a semi-tropical coca-growing area about 120 kilometres to the east of the capital. It was an absolutely unforgettable ride, clambering to 4,800 metres before plunging to about 1,500 metres in less than 100 kilometres along a perilously unprotected road. It was such a pleasure to be away from the high ground, though you were never left in any doubt as to what the coca farmers of the area thought about the gringos, with whom we were, for better or for worse, identified. We saw one poster which read, "Grow coca to kill the gringos." The peasant riots subsided and we made our way north to Lake Titicaca and Peru. The riding was again spectacular and spectacularly grueling. Sylvia crashed, and we had to put her and her bike onto a truck to the next town to get the bike fixed. Before I caught up with the truck, I was sitting having a drink in a roadside cafe somewhere between Puno and Cusco when a group of Swiss cyclists pulled up outside. They were cycling from, wait for it, Alaska to Tierra del Fuego. They'd just come from Cusco, which was where we were next headed, and so I was interested to hear more about this place, which was supposed to be one of the major highlights of the Cordillera. What was it like? I asked. Well, we only spent 24 hours there, they answered. Why? I asked. Well, if we stop anywhere for more than that, we completely lose the inclination to go on, they said. They seemed to be harnessed to a runaway. But if the road was grim for me, I don't care to imagine what it must have been like for them. I eventually caught up with Sylvia, and we got her bike fixed before taking time off to be tourists in Cusco and Machu Picchu. We stood and marvelled at Inca masonry. I mean, I couldn't do something like this with Lego. Our Andean adventure was far from over, though, because the Shining Path guerrillas had blown up the bridges on the track we were going to take to get down to the Nazca lines. Our only alternative was to slog north through the mountains, where we were told not to camp and not to travel after dark because of the threat of more guerrilla activity. We even ran a guerrilla roadblock, Sylvia shooting ahead of me in a cloud of dust, and me gunning my bike after her as non-uniformed men wildly waved rifles at us. A month or two later and the tropics were on us, and probably the first rain we had had since the south of Chile. The Ecuadorian jungle was a fascinating place at the time, not just because of the way that people did things like this, but because you would come round a corner in the middle of the forest and find yourself face to face with state-of-the-art war machinery hiding behind camouflage in forest clearings. We were to learn later that the Americans were doing quite a lot of training for the Nicaraguan Contra guerrillas in remote places in the Ecuadorian jungle where conditions were similar to the ones that they encountered back home. We also made our way across the Panama Canal to Costa Rica and Nicaragua, which was such a beautiful, sad place. People serenaded you at the drop of a hat, and the revolution was still very much alive in their hearts at that time. They had paid a high price for their opposition to their powerful neighbour to the north, though. You could feel you were getting closer to America every mile you rode. There were more tourists, and when I went into one petrol station in the Mexican Yucatan, the owner just put up his hands, palms forward, and apologized. No petrol, the Americans just bought it all. A few miles down the road I caught up with the culprits, a whole convoy of RVs laying siege to everything they went near. In some ways we were dying to get to the States. We'd been in South America for more than a year, and we'd had our fair share of hardships and mishaps, though nothing compared to what the average citizen endures. We needed a break, and to put our feet up for a while, and yet, when we crossed into the States at San Isidro, south of San Diego, we felt a sudden nostalgia for the places we had come from. The States comes in all shapes and sizes too, of course, but they all seemed to be big and rather daunting. Sylvia and I were coming to the end of our adventure together as she was due to return to South Africa from the States. We had our last few months together visiting the northwest coast of the US and Canada, and then, wrenching ourselves apart in San Francisco, I headed south to LA to join a ship for the next stage of my journey across the Pacific Ocean to New Zealand. So it was time to crate up the bikes again and bid farewell to each other and the Americas. The ship I was to join as a supernumerary was a huge German container vessel. I'd heard through the grapevine of travellers you constantly meet that they were one of the few shipping lines which still did this. As it was a German ship, I was at pains when I introduced myself to the captain in Los Angeles to say that I spoke quite reasonable German. This would be an advantage in communicating with the other crew members who were all from Germany. I was assigned to duties in the engine room. Engine room is a misleadingly mild term for the place on a 40,000-ton ship where all the propulsion and other machinery are housed. I couldn't believe my ears when, on the day of our departure, the engine was started. Within minutes, the whole of the engine room, which is actually about 10 stories high from hull to funnel top, began to shriek, roar, and hiss like a deranged beast of Fritz Lang's imagining. The temperature quickly rose to about 38 degrees, and the chief engineer explained that that was what it would remain at until the engines were switched off 2 weeks later in Auckland. At least when you went on deck for the first few days after leaving LA, the air was cooler. But as we approached the equator, there was precious little relief inside or out. Every morning at 6 you would don your overalls, take salt tablets, and put in earplugs, and then mufflers over your ears, and then enter the inferno. You can imagine what this did to the spoken interactions that I had with other members of the crew, but I understood enough to know that I was supposed to get a bucket of soapy water and a rag and, in inverted commas, clean the engine room. Understanding the instruction was one thing. Following it was at the limit of my ability as a mere mortal. For about a week I did it, though, and then for the second week I painted what I had cleaned. As we approached Auckland in New Zealand, the chief engineer said that he was very happy with my work, and that if I ever decided I wanted to undertake another passage with them, I'd be more than welcome. Even though I knew that at some stage I'd want to cross the Tasman Sea to Australia, I knew then that I would cave in and take the plane instead. My bike was supposed to have travelled with me on the ship, and so I was looking forward to finding it when I disembarked in Auckland. You can imagine the look on my face, however, when I was told that it was not on the ship's cargo manifest. Where had it got to? It had never left LA. How long would it take to get here? Well, rough guess, about a month. I thought at the time, incredibly lucky to know someone in Auckland who could lend me a bike, but I soon realised that it was a thoroughly mixed blessing. I set off to tour North Island and almost immediately crashed. I had the bike fixed, but it became increasingly clear that it and me were not meant to be together. I crashed twice more before I parked it up somewhere in South Island and took to exploring New Zealand on foot, revelling in the network of phenomenal hiking trails the place is blessed with. Believe everything you've ever been told about the unsurpassed beauty of New Zealand. It is all incontrovertibly true. I loved it for the healing energy it bathed me in. I think that leaving Sylvia and then the rigours of the Pacific Ocean crossing, and then to crown it all, the, I hoped, temporary loss of my motorbike, had left me feeling it more than just a loss. Road signs notwithstanding, I was losing my way with my journey. I was nevertheless overjoyed to be reunited with my bike when I got to Australia. I never saw it at all in New Zealand. After several false starts, including one leaving Auckland Harbour on a ship which not quite sank, but which suffered enough engine trouble to have to return to port for repairs, maybe I'd left a rag or a paintbrush somewhere I shouldn't have, it finally made it to Sydney. I was, however, entering something of a crisis in the journey. After about 3.5 years on the road, I was beginning to ask too many questions. What was I doing, and why? I tried to push these to the back of my mind as I travelled the length of the east coast of Australia, from Melbourne in the south to Cooktown in the tropical north. I had made up my mind to try and cross the country from east to west, right through the centre on remote byways. It seemed, though, as if my bike was not having any of it. At absolutely critical moments, it staged spectacular breakdowns, leaving me high and dry on baking desert roads. No matter how much care and attention I lavished on it, it just refused to go along with my plan. Or at least, that was the way it seemed. I know you'll say that it was just a machine and that sort of thing is pure fancy, but if it was just a machine, then its accidental failures were extremely well timed. Though I made it across to Perth and indeed shipped the bike on to travel for a few months in Southeast Asia, the feeling remains with me that the journey ended here, and it was as if the bike had chosen it for me. With hindsight, I'm grateful that something stopped me. To have gone on would have been to court danger in some way. Already when I was in Southeast Asia, I managed to damage one of my ears enough to have surgery, and then one fateful night, all my money and valuables were stolen from the bike. The last theft I had suffered was nearly 4 years ago, when a spare rear tyre I was carrying was stolen in Eilat, Israel. I had reached an end to the means, in more ways than one. Although all things considered, I think I probably came off slightly better than Peter Fonda and Dennis Hopper in Easy Rider, don't you?